This was a time when science and faith stood on opposite sides of a deep divide. It was a time when a doctor's desire to heal required a terrible secret. This is the story of how that secret tore the city in two. To understand the riot, we must first understand the doctors. In the late 1700s, medicine was a difficult profession. Physicians wanted to save lives. They wanted to stop sickness and fix injuries. But to do this, they needed to know how the human body worked. They needed to study anatomy. They needed to cut open bodies to see the bones, the muscles, and the organs. This practice was called dissection. It was the only way for medical students to learn. However, the law and the people stood in their way. In colonial America, and in the early years of the United States, the law strictly forbade the dissection of human bodies. Religious beliefs said that the body was sacred. People believed that for a person to go to heaven, the body had to stay whole in the grave. If the body was cut or harmed, the soul could not rest. This belief was strong among all classes of people. The government listened to the people. The laws stated that only executed criminals could be given to doctors for study. The problem for the doctors was a simple math problem. There were very few executions in New York City. There were many medical students. At Columbia College, the young men studying medicine were eager to learn, but there were no bodies to learn on. The supply could not meet the demand. This pressure created a black market. This black market was the domain of the resurrection men. These men were body snatchers. They were thieves who worked in the dark of night. They dug up fresh graves in the local churchyards. They took the corpses out of the earth. They sold these bodies to the doctors at the hospitals and colleges. It was a dangerous and illegal trade, but the doctors paid well. The professors at New York Hospital and Columbia College looked the other way. They needed the bodies to teach their classes. They accepted the stolen corpses without asking questions. For a long time, the doctors kept this secret. The citizens of New York began to notice. Families would go to the cemetery to visit a loved one who had died recently. They would find the grave disturbed. The dirt was loose. The coffin was empty. Whispers spread through the city. People said the doctors were stealing their dead. Fear grew in the neighborhoods. The poor were the most afraid. They could not afford heavy stone coffins or iron gates to protect their graves. They knew the doctors preferred the bodies of the poor because no one would question their disappearance. The tension in the city was like a tightrope. On one side were the wealthy, educated doctors. They believed they were serving the greater good. They thought saving future lives was more important than respecting dead bodies. On the other side were the working people. They valued their traditions and their right to bury their kin in peace. They saw the doctors not as healers, but as monsters. The breaking point came in the middle of April. The weather was getting warmer. Spring was coming to New York. A group of children were playing near the grounds of New York Hospital. The hospital was located on what is now Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan. It was a large brick building. It housed the sick and the medical school. A young boy looked up at a window of the hospital. He saw a medical student inside. The student was holding something in his hand. It was an arm. It was a human arm. The boy looked closely at the hand. He saw something that made his heart stop. He saw a small mark on the hand. It was a familiar mark. He believed it was the arm of his own mother. His mother had died recently. He ran home as fast as he could. The boy told his father what he had seen. The father's name was John Hicks. Some stories say he was a mason. Others say he was a laborer. Regardless of his trade, his anger was explosive. He gathered his wife and they went to the hospital. They demanded to see the dissecting room. They wanted to know if the boy was right. A group of men joined them. They went to the hospital and knocked on the door. The doctors allowed them in. They wanted to prove they were innocent. They led the family to the room where the anatomy classes were held. The air in the room was thick and smelled of chemicals. There were tables with bodies on them. There were jars with organs floating in liquid. John Hicks and his wife looked at the bodies. They did not find the mother's body. They did not find the arm. But they found something worse. They found other bodies. They saw the bodies of people they knew from their neighborhood. They saw the evidence of the body snatching. The doctors had been digging up the local graves. The anger of the small group turned into a fury. The Hicks family left the hospital. They went into the streets. They shouted to everyone who would listen. They told the neighbors what they had seen. They said the doctors were stealing their wives, their husbands, and their children. The news moved fast. Crowds began to form. Men left their workshops. Women left their homes. The mob grew in size. By late afternoon, hundreds of people were marching toward the hospital. The doctors inside the hospital saw the crowd coming. They knew the danger was real. They locked the doors. They sent for the sheriff. They sent for the mayor. They tried to hide the evidence of their work. They threw bodies out of windows or hid them in closets. They tried to make the rooms look clean, but the smell of death could not be hidden. The mob arrived at the hospital gates. They did not talk quietly. They yelled and screamed. They demanded the doctors come out. They wanted justice. They wanted to stop the grave robbing forever. A few brave students stood at the front door. They tried to talk to the crowd. They tried to explain that they were only trying to learn medicine. The crowd did not want to hear it. A young man named John Hicks Jr. was at the front. Some say he was the son of the man who had first entered the hospital. He stood on the steps. He yelled at the mob. He told them to attack. He picked up a stone and threw it at a window. The glass shattered. This was the signal. The mob surged forward. The wooden doors of the hospital could not hold back the pressure of so many people. The doors broke open. The crowd rushed inside. They went room by room. They pulled down the shelves. They smashed the glass jars. They threw the medical instruments into the street. They found the anatomical theater. They saw the tables and the ropes used for dissection. They tore the room apart. They found human remains. They took the bodies and threw them out the windows into the street. The doctors and students ran for their lives. They climbed out of back windows. They ran across the roofs of nearby buildings. They scrambled down alleyways to escape the wrath of the crowd. Some of the most prominent doctors in the city fled in terror. Dr. Richard Bailey was a leading surgeon at the hospital. He managed to escape, but his home would become a target later. For now, he ran to save his life. The mob was not satisfied with just destroying the inside of the hospital. They wanted to burn it down. They gathered wood and straw in the cellar. They lit fires. The flames began to lick the walls of the hospital. The building was in danger of total destruction. The city officials finally arrived. Mayor James Duane came to the scene. He saw the smoke. He heard the yelling. He knew he had to act fast to save the building and the doctors inside. He stood on a carriage. He raised his hands. He spoke to the crowd. He told them he understood their anger. He promised them that the doctors would be punished. He asked them to let the courts handle the matter. The crowd listened for a moment, but the anger was too hot. A few people in the mob began to shout at the mayor. They did not trust the city leaders. They believed the rich leaders protected the rich doctors. The fires continued to burn. Mayor Duane called for the militia. He ordered the troops to march to the hospital. The soldiers arrived with their muskets and bayonets. They formed a line between the mob and the burning building. The commander ordered the mob to disperse. He told them to go home. The mob refused. They stood their ground. They threw stones at the soldiers. The tension reached its peak. The soldiers raised their guns. The crowd did not move. It seemed like a massacre was about to happen. People were going to die. The mayor stepped between the soldiers and the crowd. He pleaded with the people one last time. He told them that blood would not solve this problem. He said the city would investigate the body snatching. Slowly, the crowd began to break up. Some people drifted away. The leaders of the mob realized that fighting the army would lead to death. The fires were put out. The hospital was saved, but it was ruined inside. The doctors had escaped. The mob had made their point. But the story did not end that night. The city was quiet, but the fear remained. The doctors had fled to a safer place. They knew the mob might come back. They went to the city jail. They asked the sheriff for protection. They thought the jail was the strongest building in the city. They thought they would be safe there. The next day, the mood of the city changed. The anger returned. Rumors spread that the doctors were hiding in the jail. The crowd gathered again. This time they were larger. There were thousands of people. They marched from the hospital to the jail. The jail was called the New Gal. It stood on the east side of the city, near the city hall. The mob surrounded the jail. They demanded the doctors be handed over. They wanted to drag the doctors into the street and punish them themselves. They did not trust the courts. The sheriff, named Isaac Varian, stood at the door. He refused to let the mob in. He had a few deputies, but they were not enough to stop the tide of people. The crowd began to throw stones at the jail windows. They used heavy timbers to ram the doors. The sound of the wood crashing echoed through the streets. The doctors inside watched from the barred windows. They knew if the door broke, they would die. The city leaders realized this was a major crisis. The riot was no longer just about a hospital. It was a challenge to the law and order of the city. If the mob could storm the jail, no one was safe. The leaders called for the militia again. This time, the call was urgent. The governor of New York, George Clinton, heard the news. He was at his estate in upstate New York, but he kept in touch with the city. He knew the situation was bad. He sent orders to the military commander in the city. His orders were clear: stop the riot by any means necessary. The militia gathered in the park. It was called the Fields, or the Common. Today, it is City Hall Park. The commander was a man named General Matthew Clarkson. He was a respected veteran of the Revolutionary War. He had hundreds of men under his command. They had cannons. They had muskets. They marched toward the jail. The mob saw the soldiers coming. They did not back down. They were too angry. They were too focused on the doctors inside. They ignored the soldiers and continued to attack the jail doors. The door began to splinter. General Clarkson gave the order. He told his men to load their weapons. He hoped the show of force would scare the crowd away. He did not want to kill his own citizens. He waited for a moment. He watched the door break. The mob surged inside the jail yard. There was no time left. He gave the command to fire. The soldiers pulled their triggers. The sound of musket fire ripped through the air. Smoke filled the street. The crowd did not expect the shots to be real. People fell to the ground. Screams of pain replaced the shouts of anger. The firing continued for several minutes. The crowd was taken by surprise. They panicked. They turned and ran. They trampled over each other to get away from the guns. The streets of New York became a scene of chaos and blood. When the smoke cleared, the bodies of the rioters lay on the ground. No one knows for sure how many people died that day. Some historians say it was as few as 3. Others say it was as many as 20. The exact number is lost to history, but the impact was clear. The doctors' mob had turned into a tragedy. The silence that fell over New York after the militia fired their guns was heavy. The smoke from the muskets drifted away, but the damage was done. The street in front of the jail was stained. Bodies of the rioters lay on the cold ground. The doctors were safe inside the jail, but they were prisoners of fear. The city had changed. The trust between the people and the government was broken. The violence had stopped, but the anger was still alive, buried deep in the hearts of the citizens. The morning after the shooting, the city woke up to a grim reality. The doctors who had barricaded themselves inside the jail could not stay there forever. They were safe from the mob, but they were not free. The city leaders knew they had to move the doctors to a secure location. They also knew that the doctors needed to leave the city for their own safety. A plan was made in secret. Under the cover of darkness and guarded by armed troops, the doctors were taken out of the jail. They were put onto boats and sent away from New York. Some went to the countryside, others went to different cities. They left behind their careers and their reputation for a time. While the doctors fled, the focus of the city turned to the dead. The coroner of the city assembled a jury. Their job was to investigate the deaths of the rioters. They had to decide who was at fault. This was a difficult task. The soldiers had fired on civilians. The mob had attacked a government building. The city was divided. Some people said the soldiers were murderers. Others said the soldiers were heroes who protected the law. The coroner's jury viewed the bodies. They heard testimony from the soldiers. They listened to witnesses who stood in the crowd. After hearing all the facts, the jury made their decision. They ruled that the soldiers acted in self-defense. They stated that the mob was trying to burn down the jail and kill the prisoners. The soldiers had no choice but to fire. The verdict was justifiable homicide. This decision did not please everyone. To the families of the dead, it felt like a betrayal. They felt the law protected the rich doctors, but not the poor people.
The riot was not just a fight about bodies, it became a fight about politics. New York City was a political battleground. There were two main groups. One group was the Federalists. They wanted a strong central government. They were usually wealthy merchants and professionals. Many of the doctors were Federalists. The other group was the Anti-Federalists. They wanted more power for the states and the common people. The mob was mostly made up of Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most famous Federalists in New York. He was a hero of the Revolution and a future leader of the country. Hamilton was also a friend to the doctors. He believed in the importance of medical education. He did not participate in the riots, but he supported the doctors' right to study anatomy. Because of his position, Hamilton became a target. A few days after the riot, the anger of the crowd shifted back to the elites. A rumor spread that Alexander Hamilton was hiding the doctors. A large mob formed again. They marched not to the jail, but to Hamilton's home. His house was a target for their rage. Hamilton was inside with his family. He heard the shouting. He heard the stones hitting his walls. Hamilton knew he could not fight the mob alone. He also knew he could not hide. He stepped out of his house. He stood on his porch. He faced the angry crowd. He spoke to them with courage. He told them he was not hiding anyone. He tried to reason with them. He appealed to their sense of justice and law. For a moment, the crowd paused. They respected Hamilton for his role in the war, but the tension was high. It took the arrival of a group of Hamilton's friends to disperse the crowd. They formed a protective ring around him. This event showed how deep the political divide went. The riot was now a threat to the city's leaders. As the days passed, the immediate violence subsided. The city began to heal its physical wounds, but the emotional wound remained open. The doctors who had fled started to return. They knew they could not stay away forever, but they also knew they could not continue as they had before. The system of body snatching had to change. The doctors realized that the secret trade in corpses was too dangerous. They needed a legal solution. A group of doctors, led by Dr. Richard Bailey and Dr. Samuel Bard, came together. They decided to ask the government for help. They drafted a petition. They sent it to the New York State Legislature. The petition was honest. It admitted that doctors had been using unauthorized bodies, but it explained why. It said that without dissection, medical students could not learn to treat the sick. It said that the lack of knowledge hurt everyone. They asked the government to pass a new law. The petition created a new controversy. The people of New York still did not want their graves disturbed. They hated the idea of doctors cutting up bodies. But the riots had shown everyone that the current system was broken. The violence had proved that something had to give. The legislators listened to both sides. They listened to the angry citizens who wanted their dead to rest in peace. They listened to the doctors who wanted to save lives.
The debate in the legislature was long and heated. The representatives argued about morality and science. They argued about the rights of the dead and the needs of the living. Finally, a compromise was reached. It was a solution that tried to respect both views. In the year 1789, 1 year after the riots, the New York State Legislature passed a new law. It was titled An Act to Prevent the Odious Practice of Digging Up and Removing for the Purpose of Dissection Dead Bodies Interred in Cemeteries or Burial Places. This law made grave robbing a serious crime. It increased the punishment for anyone caught stealing bodies. This part of the law satisfied the people. However, the law also did something the doctors wanted. It changed the rules for anatomical dissection. The law stated that the bodies of executed criminals could be used for medical study. But it went further. It said that if no one claimed a body of a person who died in a public institution like a prison or an almshouse, that body could also be given to the doctors. This provided a legal supply of bodies. It meant that doctors did not have to rely on body snatchers. They could get bodies through the law. This was a turning point in American medicine. It was the first time a state had passed a comprehensive law to regulate anatomy study. The law did not make everyone happy. Many people still disliked the idea of dissection. But the law removed the secrecy. It took the profit away from the grave robbers. It put the practice under the control of the government. It turned a criminal act into a legal medical procedure. The passage of the law was a victory for Dr. Richard Bailey and his colleagues. Bailey went on to found the New York Hospital Dispensary, which provided care to the poor. He tried to rebuild the trust between the medical community and the citizens. He knew that trust was essential. He worked hard to show that the doctors were not enemies of the people, but servants of their health. The riots also changed the way medical schools operated. New York Hospital and Columbia College rebuilt their anatomy labs. They were more open about their work. They invited the public to see the facilities. They tried to educate the people about why dissection was necessary. They wanted to remove the fear that comes from the unknown. Over time, the memory of the 1788 riots began to fade. The city grew and changed. New buildings covered the sites of the violence. But the doctors' mob left a permanent mark on American history. It highlighted a problem that every city had to face. How do we balance respect for the dead with the needs of the living? New York found a way through a new law. Other states watched New York closely. In the years that followed, many other states passed similar laws. They used the New York model as an example. There is a lesser-known fact about the aftermath of the riot that deserves to be told. The attack on the jail and the shooting of the rioters actually helped to shape the United States Constitution. At the time, the country was debating whether to ratify the Constitution. The anti-federalists in New York used the riot as an argument. They said that a strong federal government would use the army to crush the people, just as the militia had crushed the mob. The Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, argued that the riot showed the need for a strong government to maintain order. This debate influenced the fight for the Bill of Rights. The people wanted guarantees that the government would not use its power to oppress them. The story of the doctors' mob is a story of fear and misunderstanding. It is a story of a time when science moved faster than the law. The doctors wanted to do good, but they did it in a bad way. They ignored the feelings of the people. The people wanted to protect their dead, but they used violence to do it. Both sides made mistakes. In the end, the riots forced the city to confront the problem. The violence was the catalyst for change. Without the riot, the law might not have passed for many years. The doctors might have continued to steal bodies in the dark. The people might have continued to live in fear. The blood shed on that April day paved the way for the legal system of anatomical donation we have today.